It's hard to believe that a recipe that begins, take 3 pounds of pork roast and boil for 1 to 2 hours, can make something that looks as good as this.
Middle shelf, fourth book from the right, page 82. How to Cook Forsoothly by Mistress Katrine D. Baillie do chat, OL. Pumps. Pork meatballs.
There's a lot to discuss about this recipe, but the pork's got to boil for a couple of hours, so let's get that started, and then we'll come back and talk about this thing. The pork itself is a simple roast. It was on sale at my grocery store. It's 3 pounds exactly. It came pre-trussed, just like this. The recipe says to boil the meat and later discard the water, but I want to use that, so I'm going to plus up the water just a little bit. I'm going to throw in half an onion, and then to really kick it up, I've got the Better Than Bouillon. It's the roasted garlic flavor, and I'm going to put in really just what's left in the jar and stir all that around. And then I'll put the pork right in there, bone side down, just to keep it off the bottom. I'll bring the broth up to a boil, and then I'll turn the heat down, put a lid on it, and just let it sit there and simmer for a couple of hours to let it all get tender. And while it's doing that, we'll keep an eye on it, but let's get back to that recipe and chat a bit. This book was written for folks in the Society for Creative Anachronism. They put on events where they reenact an idealized version of the Middle Ages. And I used to be very active in this group when I was in college, loved it a lot. I still have many friends who play, and I miss it myself sometimes. This book itself, written by someone who is very well respected in the society, and it's a recipe book of medieval dishes to prepare for events. So this was definitely a work of love, not something that was done as a commercial endeavor, not something you could go to a bookstore and buy. I got it in my days playing in the society. And this particular recipe was originally written down in 1430 and has a long history of rewrites and adaptations and so forth. This particular book tried to use the original recipe as the source, and this is it in calligraphy form in Old English. Now, as soon as I saw the opening lines about taking the pork and boiling it for a couple of hours, I knew I needed to stop and do some additional reading and see what the heck was going on there, because I could tell that was not an ideal way to start a meatball recipe. And sure enough, I did some research and saw that there is a lot of academics talking about this source recipe from 1430, thinking that's a rewrite of an earlier recipe and that there was something that was just written down wrong to begin with. As we'll see when we make this, there's no binders, there's nothing that would help the meatball hold its shape like you would find in modern meatballs. There's no eggs, there's no breadcrumbs, there's nothing like that. It's just the pork and some fruit and some spices served in a warm broth. This particular project, one of the rules that I set for myself is I was going to make the recipes that were in the book as they are in the book. So going in, I knew that this could be better, and I know how to make it better. I did a little bit just within the wiggle room that the recipe gave for me. Reading here also, I saw there was some additional problems. There is a list of ingredients, and then down in the recipe itself, she has a different set of ingredients. So it's like she started with one, and then her methods used a different set. I just used my best judgment to do what I thought would work the best given what was there in the book. So given all of those disclaimers and a little bit of history, let's continue on. A couple hours have gone by, so I took the meat out of the broth that it's been sitting in and set it on a rack to cool. Our next step for that is going to be to chop it up as fine as we can. So I want that to be fairly cool before we do that. She says in the recipe to go ahead and discard the water, but then later on she uses about the same amount of water for something else. So I decided, even if it's just a small cheat, to go ahead and save this water. The ingredients we're going to use now are pretty typical for medieval meat recipes, and you'll recognize them if you've ever had a mincemeat pie. We've got currants, which are a raisin made from a super tiny grape, mace, which is the wrapping on the outside of a nutmeg. We've got some ground cloves. We have a little bit of sugar, some rice flour, and some almond meal. We'll start with the cloves and the mace, as well as the currants, and you can see how tiny they are, just itty bitty little raisins. That's going to get all mixed in with the meat once we chop it. And they wanted us to chop it as fine as possible. Now, in my last video, making the giant batch of Scottish bread, I said I wanted to do everything by hand, so I kneaded and mixed and did all of that by hand instead of breaking out my stand mixer and using the dough hook. This time, though, knowing that there was going to be some problems with the structure of the meatballs, rather than using my knife skills to spend a long time mincing things up, I decided that I'd just go ahead and use the meat grinder attachment to my stand mixer. So I cut things up by hand into small pieces and then bring out my larger cousin to the Silver Fox, the KitchenAid stand mixer featured on the Anti-Chef's YouTube channel, one of my favorite shows to watch. Years ago, my buddy Steve, one of my inspirations in the kitchen, gifted me with a set of KitchenAid attachments, including the meat grinder, and I don't use it very often, but this is a perfect time to do so. Rather than chop the currants every so often, I just threw some of those into the hopper too, to get them all ground up and mixed in with the meat. I added the mace and the cloves and stirred everything up so it was all well mixed, and then formed them into meatballs about 2 inches across. I just pressed them heavily in my hand to kind of mash them together as tight as they could, knowing they could fall apart at any time. And then I just set them aside on a little tray to stay warm while I prepared the sauce. Here is where the list of ingredients in the recipe said different things. The ingredients said to just use 3 cups of almond milk here, but in the instructions she made her own kind of version of almond milk using water and ground almonds and honey and a little bit of salt. And so I went with that route, but instead of just water, I used the broth from the pork that I had set aside. So we've got the 3 cups of that. I stir in the almond meal. It'll clump up on you, so I wanted to stir it and break up those little clumps. Added the honey, and I skipped the salt because the broth had salt in it already, and that was my almond milk. We gently heat that up and bring it to a boil. It'll thicken up a little bit on its own because of the almonds. But once it's at a nice boil, then we can add the rice flour. Nice and slow, just dribble it in a bit at a time and stir it so that you don't get clumps. And after a couple of moments, that'll thicken up very nicely. So the last thing to do is just pour it over our meatballs, and it's just about ready to serve. In the ingredient list, she says we need some mace and sugar to sprinkle over the top here, but down in the instructions, she says to use some clove and sugar instead. I just mixed all 3, so a little bit of clove, a little bit of mace, and a little bit of sugar just sprinkled over the top. So here's another glamour shot, and again, I was impressed with how good it looked at the end, but I knew just shaping them that I was going to have those issues of meatballs holding together. So very gingerly, I put them into a serving bowl and put some of the broth on there and gave it a taste. First off, let me say I love the broth. I'm going to make that again, and I'm glad I didn't use just a carton of almond milk, that I used the method that was described in the recipe itself. It's just a wonderful broth, and I can think of all kinds of uses for that. You can see that the meatballs fell apart just right away. As soon as you put your spoon or fork into them, they just sort of crumble, and that was off-putting in texture. The flavor itself, very strong, the clove and the mace. If you're used to medieval flavors, it's quite tasty. I'm glad one of my medieval recipes came up so early in the project. I've got several books of medieval recipes. I wish this one had been written a little bit better, but I'm glad it was chosen, and I'm looking forward to the next one. Thanks, Siri.